Andrew Johnson was the military governor of Tennessee before he was named by the Republican Party to become the vice presidential nominee for Abraham Lincoln in the upcoming 1864 presidential election. Lincoln's former vice president during his first term, Hannibal Hamlin, was passed over by Johnson due to Lincoln looking for a VP that could appeal to the South during the planned reconstruction of the former Confederate States after the inevitable end of the war. The Republican Lincoln and the Democrat Johnson ran together as a National Union Party and easily won the presidential election. After a couple months later, Lincoln messaged Johnson when he could arrive in Washington, D.C. to be inaugurated as the vice president. Johnson replied to Lincoln and asked that his inauguration be delayed until after the newly organized Tennessee state government was operational, which would not be until early April. Lincoln replied that he had consulted with the cabinet and it's on our unanimous conclusion that it is unsafe for you to not be here on the 4th of March. Be sure to reach here by that time. Before he arrived in Washington, D.C. in the first week of March, according to those close to him, Andrew Johnson went on the biggest bender of his life. He reportedly was drinking for several weeks non-stop before arriving in D.C. According to a secretary, when he was the military governor of Tennessee, Ben Truman, Andrew Johnson stayed away from beer, wine, and cocktails, but drank exclusively sour mash whiskey. He would usually drink about 0 to 4 glasses a day. He arrived in Washington, D.C. on March 1st and rested at the nearby Metropolitan Hotel until he went to a party on March 3rd. The party was hosted by the Secretary of the Senate and publisher John W. Fourney. The two shared many glasses of whiskey, which left Johnson with a reportedly thunderous hangover. The next day, on March 4th, Johnson was picked up and escorted to the Capitol by Senator James Doolittle around 10:30 a.m. for his scheduled inauguration and speech, which was to take place at noon. According to an eyewitness, Andrew Johnson drank 3 large glasses of whiskey that were served neat within a half hour from 11 to 11:30 a.m. One of the witnesses, Union Army Major Charles Hamlin, the son of the outgoing Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, said, "When Johnson came to Washington to be inaugurated, he was accompanied by enthusiastic friends and admirers from Tennessee. There was a great deal of drinking and jubilation among them, and Johnson was already on the verge of another spree when the day came for him to be inducted into office. He called at the Senate chamber shortly before the hour of the inauguration and found Vice President Hamlin and General Charles Hamlin waiting for him in the former's private room. There was a cordial conversation, and then Johnson said, 'Mr. Hamlin, I am not well, and I need a stimulant. Have you any whiskey?' 'No,' replied Hamlin. 'When I became vice president, I gave an order prohibiting the sale of liquor in the Senate restaurant, but if you desire, I will send across the street for some whiskey.' Mr. Johnson expressed his wish for liquor, and the messenger procured him a bottle. He filled a table glass up to the brim and drank it down without any water. He then resumed conversation and began to tell Mr. Hamlin of his ambition to make the effort of his life when taking the oath of office. While talking all of this time, he poured another glass full to the brim and rapidly down. Mr. Hamlin afterwards said to his son that this made him a little apprehensive, but knowing that Johnson was a hard drinker, he supposed he could stand the liquor he had taken. They were up to this time, indeed. Nothing to indicate that the whiskey had affected Johnson. A moment later, word was given that it was time for the inauguration process to start. Vice President Hamlin offered Mr. Johnson his arm, and they started to leave the room when General Hamlin followed them. They had hardly stepped out of the room when Johnson excused himself, hurriedly turned back, almost running into General Hamlin. The general, naturally, turned around to see what the matter was and saw Johnson stepping up to the table where the whiskey was and poured down a third tumblerful. He then hurried back to the Senate chamber and took his seat on the dais. The Senate room began to fill with politicians and the press, anticipating the arrival of Vice President-elect Andrew Johnson and waiting to witness his inauguration and the 7-minute speech he was going to deliver afterwards. Journalist for the Sacramento Union, Noah Brooks, wrote that Johnson's face was extraordinarily red and that he was evidently intoxicated. Other journalists in the press gallery also noticed Johnson's appearance. A journal for the Cincinnati Commercial wrote, "Drunkenness may be entered as a plea and abatement for he has been crazed with liquor for several preceding days. As he entered the chamber, his frame shook with a tremor of debauch." Another, from the Times of London, said, "He had not uttered 2 sentences when everything and everyone saw something was wrong. Once he had got going, Johnson proceeded to lecture the senators, the cabinet members, and the justices alike on the founts of power in the democratic society." A correspondent for the New York Herald said, "The senators began to look at each other with significance as to say, 'Is he crazy?' or 'What is the matter?' It was not only a 99-rate stump speech, but disgraceful in the extreme." The Democratic senators began to lean forward and appeared to be chuckling with each other at the figures made by the Republican Party through their vice president-elect. The sentences were so incoherent, it is impossible to give an accurate report of the speech. It is terrible to say that his condition was such that he was unfit to make a speech. The effort of the vice president-elect to go through with the form of reading the sentences, as read by Mr. Hamlin, was painful in the extreme. He stumbled, he stammered, he repeated portions of it several times over. Brooks wrote about the swearing-in ceremony. Johnson's oath was inaudible, but he was done. Johnson turned, took the Bible in his hand, and facing the audience said with a loud theatrical voice and gesture, "I kiss this book in the face of my nation of the United States." Reverend Henry Ward Beecher said he saw the Bible whirled by the incoming VP about his head like a cap. When a man gives 3 cheers, the spectacle of an inebriated vice president hiccoughing out his oath of office furnished such a text for discourse on temperance as hardly turns up once in an age. Another eyewitness in the press gallery said Johnson had dribbled over the holy book as he took the oath of office. He described the speech as an idiotic babble of mind besotted by a fortnight's debauch. This cannot be covered up as a private infirmity. Mr. Johnson made a similar exhibition of himself here, and we might then refrain on commenting on it because we thought it might only be a lapse in the interval when he was free from public duties. Johnson turned towards the crowd and gave his speech and said, "Thou says this is the most suspicious moment of my existence, and say the life. Even if I swear, elections will tell about sports and seats, concessions, sport all houses. Do you know who I am? You know who I am? My name is Andy Johnson. I'm from Tennessee, and I'm pulling all down with populist public, and the Constitution constitutes from plans, the concession and straight in life from before the Senate that I should know myself. I'm a man, brother American citizens, and I'm a proud listener of the fact that plenty of man from the ranks can be elevated in the second with the market given place of American people. Fellas, I'm a point and 2 misfires. The other point from point and 2 time was a Taylor boy. And tell what playing old dabbing the Supreme Court driven constitute from his American plea, but tumor. And it's a fact. At a point, Tennessee lowly glory just in my fellow twins' fact on that point. After the swearing-in ceremony and speech, many of the people in the crowd were in utter shock. U.S. Senator Zachariah Chandler said, "I was never so mortified in my life. Had I been able to find a small hole, I should have dropped through it and out of sight. The Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, wrote about this in his diary, saying that the Vice President-elect made a rambling and strange harangue, which was listened to with pain and mortification by all of his friends. My impressions were that he was under the influence of stimulants, yet I know not that he drinks. He has been sick and is feeble. Perhaps he was taken medicine or stimulants, or his brain from sickness may have been overactive in these new responsibilities. Whatever the cause, it was in all very bad taste. The delivery of the inaugural address, the administering of the oath, and the whole department of the president were very well done, and the retiring vice president appeared to advantage when he contrasted with his successor, who has humiliated his friends. Speed, who sat at my left, whispered to me that all this wretched bad taste, and very soon, he said, the man is certainly deranged. I said to Stanton, who was on my right, Johnson is either drunk or crazy. Stanton replied, there is evidently something wrong. Seward says it was emotion on returning and revisiting to the Senate that he could appreciate Johnson's failings, who was much overcome. I hope Seward is right, but don't entirely concur with him. There is, as Stanton says, something wrong, and I hope it's sickness. Johnson had to swear in the new senators immediately after he was sworn in as vice president, but he was in no condition, so the Secretary of the Senate, John Fourney, did it instead. Later that day, the Senate walked outside to attend the second inauguration of President Lincoln. People in the audience wanted to hear a speech from the Vice President Johnson. Lincoln turned to Frederick Douglass and pointed towards Andrew Johnson. Douglass later wrote in his memoirs about this incident, Mr. Lincoln touched Mr. Johnson, had pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. Seeing that I observed him, he tried to assume a more friendly appearance, but it was too late. It was useless to close the door when all within has been seen. His first glance was that the frown of a man. The second was the bland and sickly smile of a demagogue. I turned to Mrs. Dorsey and said, whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he certainly is no friend of our race. No stronger contrast could well be presented between two men than between President Lincoln and Vice President Johnson on this day. Mr. Lincoln was like one who was treading the hard and thorny path of duty and self-denial. Mr. Johnson was like one from a drunken debauch. The face of one was full of manly humility, although at the topmost height of power and pride. The other was full of pomp and swaggering vanity. The fact, though, it was yet early in the day, Mr. Johnson was drunk. Andrew Johnson's tenure as vice president wouldn't last long because after the assassination of President Lincoln, he was sworn in as the 17th president of the United States on April 15, 1865, and he was extremely intoxicated during his hastily put-together swearing-in ceremony. According to several eyewitnesses on that night, Lincoln lay dying in his bed. Johnson was drinking heavily. When Lincoln was pronounced dead at 7:22 a.m., Johnson was in no condition to immediately be sworn in, so for a few hours there was no president until he was sobered up enough to take the oath at 10 o'clock a.m.